Punxsutawney, Jefferson County, Pennsylvania, August 1949. The air thick with the bituminous haze from the coke ovens and the humid promise of a late summer thunderstorm hung heavy over the rows of company houses. In a small clearing at the edge of the camp, where the orderly grid of miners' shacks gave way to scrub oak and slag heaps, a man was building something that made no sense. His name was Taras Kovalenko. He was not a big man, but his movements were economical and sure, the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years assembling things under pressure. He was bolting together curved ribs of corrugated steel, forming an arch that looked like a giant, half-buried tin can. By the end of the day, he and his young son, Andrew, had erected a strange, metallic skeleton, a perfect half-cylinder sitting on a freshly poured concrete slab. It was 12 feet wide and 16 feet long, with a crown that barely reached 8 feet high. The men coming off shift from the Isabella furnace stopped to watch. Their days were spent with coal and iron, with the brute force of heat and pressure, and their homes were built of the same logic: thick logs, heavy timbers, stone foundations. What they saw in Kovalenko's clearing was an absurdity. "What in God's name is that, Kovalenko?" called out Bill Putnam, a face man whose hands were permanently stained black. "You building a cook stove for a giant?" Jedediah Sykes, the shift foreman, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the slab. "Looks like a culvert pipe stood on its end. A man can't live in a pipe, Taras. It ain't decent." The mockery was good-natured at first, the kind of rough ribbing that defined life in the camp. They called it Kovalenko's can, the tin turtle, or the punksy pillbox. But as the weeks passed and the structure took its final, bizarre form, the humor curdled into genuine skepticism. Kovalenko painstakingly fitted sheets of 3-inch thick, yellow fibrous material, spun glass batting he'd bought as war surplus, between the steel ribs and an interior skin. He sealed every seam with a black, tar-like mastic. The finished object was a windowless, gleaming metal arch, broken only by a single, sturdy oak door and one small 2-by-2-foot square of glass set into the south-facing end. It looked like a toy, an oversized bread box dropped in the woods. It looked foolish. The opinion wasn't just local. One afternoon in late April, a mud-spattered sedan from the county seat rumbled up the track. Out stepped Herschel Lofton, the Jefferson County dwelling code inspector. He was a tall man in a fraying suit, a man who believed in right angles, minimum clearances, and the accumulated wisdom of Pennsylvania builders. He walked a slow circle around the Quonset, his clipboard held like a shield. He tapped the corrugated steel with a knuckle. The sound was a dull, hollow thump. "Kovalenko," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of bureaucracy. "I've had a report from the mine office. You can't be serious about wintering your family in this apparatus." Taras, who was fitting the frame for the small window, paused and wiped his hands on a rag. "It will be warm, Mr. Lofton." Lofton scoffed, a dry, incredulous sound. He flipped a page on his clipboard. "Let's talk about what it will be. According to the 1946 Pennsylvania State Dwelling Code, Section 4, Paragraph B, a permanent family dwelling must provide a minimum of 200 square feet of habitable floor space. Your slab here is 12 by 16. That's 192 square feet." He looked up, a grim finality in his eyes. "You're 8 square feet short of legal. This structure is sited. It's not a house. It's a shed. You'll need to extend it or tear it down before the first frost." He made a sharp, decisive note on his form, tore off a carbon copy, and handed it to Taras. "This isn't a suggestion." The men at the mine thought he was a fool. The county inspector thought he was a lawbreaker. As autumn deepened and the hills of Jefferson County burned with color, the small silver arch stood as a monument to one man's apparent madness. What did this Ukrainian CB veteran, this outsider from the Carpathian Mountains and the Pacific Islands, understand about the physics of a Pennsylvania winter that the experienced miners and builders, with their thick-walled log homes and blazing furnaces, had missed entirely? The answer to that question would not be found in building codes or local tradition. It would be written in degrees of temperature, in cords of wood, and in the stark contrast between survival and misery. It's a story of profound ingenuity, and if you stick with me, I promise you'll learn a fundamental principle of thermal science that is as relevant today as it was in the brutal winter of 1949. The story of Taras Kovalenko's little Quonset hut is more than just history. It's a masterclass in efficiency. If you find value in these kinds of stories, of forgotten genius and hard-won wisdom, consider subscribing to this channel. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Taras Kovalenko was not a carpenter, not in the way the men of Jefferson County understood the term. He had never hewn a log, dovetailed a joint, or chinked a wall with mud and moss. He was not a miner, though he lived in a mining town. His hands were calloused, but not from a pickaxe or a shovel. His expertise lay in other materials, other shapes. He was a builder of envelopes. He was born in America, but his soul was shaped by the stories of his immigrant parents. Tales from a village nestled in the Zakarpattia Oblast of Ukraine, a land of forested Carpathian mountains. They described round, stone and thatch cottages, built low to the ground to shed the fierce mountain winds. They spoke of the koliba, the shepherd's conical hut, a shape that held the warmth of a small fire against the sweeping cold. He'd never seen them, but the images were planted in his mind. Circles, domes, hemispheres, shapes without corners for the cold to hide in. Then came the war. Taras joined the Navy and, because of his knack for building, was assigned to the construction battalions, the Seabees. In the sweltering heat of the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, he didn't build with logs or stones. He built with steel. He and his crew could erect a full barracks for 60 men in a single day. Their primary tool was the Quonset hut. They bolted together the same steel arches he was now using in Pennsylvania, learning the simple, brutal efficiency of the form. They were cheap, strong, and went up fast. But Taras noticed something else. In the tropical sun, the uninsulated steel huts were unbearable ovens. But on the rare, cool, rainy nights, a single lantern could take the damp chill out of a small, modified command Quonset in minutes. The curved walls seemed to hold and reflect the meager warmth in a way a boxy tent never could. His mind held two sets of seemingly unrelated knowledge: the ancestral memory of round, efficient cottages in a cold climate, and the practical, hands-on experience of assembling hemispherical steel shelters in a hot one. When the war ended, he came to the bituminous camps of Pennsylvania with his wife, Olena, and their two young children, Lydia and Andrei. He took a job as a mechanic at the mine's motor pool, a position that paid just enough to get by. Their first winter, 1948, was a brutal education. They lived in a standard-issue company shack, a drafty clapboard box that seemed to actively conspire with the cold. Taras learned the hard lessons of a Pennsylvania winter not in degrees, but in a series of sharp, visceral failures. One morning in January, he went to start a neighbor's Ford coupe. The first crank was met with a sickening pop and a gush of steaming water. The radiator had split clean at the tank seam overnight. Inside his own home, the kerosene in the parlor lamp, which Olena kept full for the long nights, had refused to draw up the wick. He'd unscrewed the cap to find it had turned to a thick, translucent jelly. The final insult came on a day so cold, the very air seemed to crackle. He'd reached for his heavy wool coat, left hanging on a tipple peg near the door, and as he swung it around his shoulders, the collar, stiff with frozen condensation from his own breath, split with a sound like tearing paper. He spent that winter feeding the stove an endless diet of coal and wood, a battle he was constantly losing. The house was never truly warm, just varying degrees of cold. He and Olena slept in their clothes. The children were always coughing. The problem wasn't the fuel, it was the house itself. It was a sieve. That spring, as the ground thawed, Taras made a vow. He would not spend another winter fighting a box. He would build something different. He started making calculations on scraps of paper, sketching shapes. He remembered the round cottages of Zakarpattia and the steel arches of the Pacific. He started scouring war surplus depots. He found what he was looking for in a scrapyard outside Pittsburgh, a pile of unused, each 16-foot diameter Quonset ribs. He bought them for pennies on the dollar, along with several crates of spun glass insulation. He would build his family a harbor. The conventional wisdom in the Allegheny Mountains was to fight cold with mass. A proper house had thick log walls, the gaps stuffed with daubing, or a heavy timber frame sheathed in plank. The theory was simple. Put more material between you and the winter. The problem was, the theory was wrong, or at least it was profoundly inefficient. The typical miner's cabin in Punxsutawney was a rectangle, perhaps 16 by 24 feet. It was a shape born of convenience. Sawmills cut straight lines. Logs were straight. It was easy to build a box, but a box is a geometric catastrophe when it comes to preserving heat. Every corner is a thermal bridge, a place where the cold can wedge its way in. More importantly, for its volume, a rectangle presents a massive amount of surface area to the outside world. Each square foot of wall and roof is a tiny window through which precious warmth bleeds away. This process of heat loss is called conduction, and it is relentless. The log walls, even at 12 inches thick, were poor insulators. Old-growth timber, dense and solid, had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 1 per inch. A 12-inch log wall was R12, the same as the 3 inches of spun glass Taras was using. But logs shrink and check. The chinking between them cracks and falls out. Air infiltration, or drafts, was the real killer. Cold air knifed through 100 tiny gaps around windows, under doors, and between the logs themselves. In the Wainwright house, 2 doors down from Kovalenko's plot, Martha Wainwright spent her days in a losing battle against these drafts. She stuffed rags into the gaps around the window sashes. She hung heavy quilts over the doorways to the unused rooms. Her husband, Tom, had used nearly half their winter woodpile by the end of November, and the deep cold hadn't even arrived yet. Their house had an uninsulated attic, a vast empty space under the roof that acted like a giant chimney, pulling the warm air from the living space up and out through the shingles. The heat from their cast-iron stove rose to the 10-foot ceiling, where it was immediately sucked into the frigid attic, doing almost nothing to warm the people huddled 6 feet below. The physics was brutal. A standard log home with a 16x 24-foot footprint had about 620 square feet of exterior wall and roof surface area losing heat. In a stiff wind, the effective R value of the entire structure might drop to R4 or R5 due to air movement stripping heat from the outer surfaces and infiltrating through countless cracks. Every British thermal unit, BTU, of heat generated by their stove was fighting an impossible battle against a vast, cold, and leaky perimeter. They weren't heating their home. They were attempting to heat the entire state of Pennsylvania. Taras understood this instinctively, then proved it with mathematics. His small, curved structure was a deliberate rejection of this entire philosophy. He wasn't building with more mass. He was building with less surface. The construction of the Quonset was a spectacle of quiet defiance. Taras started in the summer, giving himself months before the cold set in. First came the foundation. He and Olena, with help from their son Andriy, dug and framed a shallow rectangle 12 by 16 feet. They mixed concrete by hand in a rented trough, pouring a 4-inch slab reinforced with wire mesh. Jedediah Sykes watched them from a distance, shaking his head. "A man's foundation ought to go below the frost line," he declared to anyone who would listen. 30 inches, minimum. That slab'll heave and crack before Christmas." Taras said nothing. He knew the slab wasn't for structural support against frost. It was an airtight seal against the ground. Next came the steel ribs. He laid them out on the grass, bolting the sections together to form complete arches. Then, one by one, he and Olena walked them upright and bolted them to anchor plates set into the concrete. By the end of a single weekend, the skeletal arch stood complete. It looked flimsy, a piece of military surplus a strong wind might carry away. The mockery intensified when Taras began installing the insulation. He methodically cut the 3-inch thick spun glass bats, a material most in the camp had never seen, and fitted them between the outer corrugated skin and a second interior layer of sheet metal. It was tedious, itchy work. He wore gloves and a mask, but still, the tiny glass fibers worked their way into his skin and clothes. Herschel Lofton, the code inspector, made a follow-up visit in September. He saw the insulation going in and let out a short, sharp laugh. "Glass? You're stuffing your walls with glass, Kovalenko? What's next, newspaper and hope?" "It holds air," Taras replied simply, not looking up from his work. "Still air does not move heat." Lofton was unmoved. "I'm telling you, this is a violation. 192 square feet. The law is the law. This citation stands. You can't live in it." The cost of the project was another point of ridicule. While his neighbors bought cords of wood and tons of coal, Taras spent his meager savings on the surplus steel, the bolts, the insulation, the window, and the small potbelly stove. The total came to just over $150. A traditional log cabin, even a small one, would cost 3 times that in materials and labor. To the camp, this cheapness was just another sign of its inadequacy. It was a temporary fix, a foolish gamble by a man who didn't understand the permanence of a real home. Finally, he installed the single oak door, carefully weather-stripping the jamb. He set the small, double-paned 2-foot window in the south-facing wall, caulking it inside and out until it was hermetically sealed. The potbelly stove, a small model designed for a caboose or a fishing shanty, was placed at the rear, its flue pipe exiting through a heavily insulated metal collar in the back wall. When it was finished, it stood in stark contrast to everything around it. The log cabins looked rooted, organic, grown from the earth. The Quonset looked like it had landed from another world. It was small, strange, and according to every expert, doomed to fail. Taras moved his family in at the end of October, just as the first cold rains of autumn began to fall. The citation from Herschel Lofton was tacked to the inside of the door, a constant reminder of the official verdict on his work. The secret of the little Quonset hut wasn't magic. It was pure mathematics and physics. What Taras Kovalenko understood, and what the builders of conventional cabins missed, was the fundamental relationship between volume, surface area, and heat loss. Imagine you want to enclose a space. The most efficient shape you can possibly choose, the one that contains the most volume with the least possible surface area, is a sphere. Taras couldn't build a perfect sphere, but by choosing a hemisphere, the Quonset's half-cylinder shape, he got as close as was practical. Let's look at the numbers, the stark, irrefutable arithmetic of the situation. The floor of the Quonset was 192 square feet. The surface area of its curved walls and 2 end caps was approximately 380 square feet. Now consider a hypothetical log cabin with the same 192 square feet of floor space, say a 12 by 16 foot box with 8-foot walls. That cabin would have 448 square feet of wall area alone. Add the roof and the total heat-losing surface balloons to over 620 square feet. The cabin had over 63% more surface area than the Quonset to enclose the exact same amount of floor space. That meant 63% more area for the precious heat to escape through. It was like trying to carry water in a bucket with 63% more holes in it. This geometric advantage was then amplified by Taras's choice of materials. The 3 inches of spun glass fiber insulation he'd packed into the walls were revolutionary for the time. This material, a precursor to modern fiberglass, worked by trapping millions of tiny pockets of air. Air itself is a fantastic insulator, but only if it's kept still. Convection, the process of warm air rising and cold air sinking, moves heat efficiently. By trapping the air in a dense mat of glass fibers, the insulation all but eliminated convection within the wall cavity. This gave the Quonset's walls a thermal resistance, or R value, of R12. As we noted, a 12-inch thick solid log wall also had an R value of roughly R12. On paper, they were equivalent, but in reality, they were worlds apart. The Quonset's insulation was a continuous, unbroken blanket. There were no logs to shrink, no chinking to crack, no gaps for drafts. The steel skin sealed with mastic created an almost perfectly airtight envelope. The log cabin was a leaky sieve. The Quonset was a thermos. At an outside temperature of 22 degrees, a bitterly cold but not unheard of temperature for a Pennsylvania winter, the total heat loss of the Quonset could be calculated. With its 380 square feet of R12 surface, it would lose roughly 3,000 BTUs per hour. A single BTU is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. 3,000 BTUs is a tiny amount of heat. A single human body at rest gives off about 400 BTUs per hour. The small pot-belly stove Taras had installed, burning just a few chunks of coal or scraps of wood, could easily pump out $8,000 to 12,000 BTUs per hour. The math was overwhelmingly in his favor. The stove produced heat 3 to 4 times faster than the building could lose it. For the neighboring log cabins, the equation was reversed. With their massive, leaky surface area, their heat loss at 22 degrees Celsius could easily top 30,000 or 40,000 BTUs per hour. Their larger stoves, burning furiously, could barely keep pace, and any lull in the fire meant the temperature inside would plummet immediately. Taras wasn't just building a different kind of house. He was operating in a different thermal universe. The first test came in December. A cold snap sent temperatures to just below zero. Inside the Quonset, a single bucket of coal kept the space a comfortable 70 degrees for a full day. Olena cooked on the flat top of the stove. Andri and Lydia played on the floor, which was noticeably warmer than the floor in their old shack because the concrete slab was insulated from the frozen earth by the air inside. But this was just a prelude. The real trial, the event that would become legend in the bituminous camps, began on the 5th of January, 1950. It was called a polar surge. A mass of Arctic air, dense and heavy, slid down from Canada, channeled through the Punxsutawney Gap, and settled over the Allegheny Plateau. For 11 straight nights, the temperature at the Isabella Furnace weather station did not rise above 22 degrees. A steady 20-mile-per-hour north wind scoured the landscape, making the effective temperature feel closer to 50. A thick, choking inversion layer clamped down on the valley, trapping the smoke from the coke ovens and 1,000 desperate chimneys, creating a perpetual, sunless twilight of gray haze. It was a winter that broke things. It broke pipes, it broke engines, and it broke spirits. At the Wainwright house, they woke to the sound of a cannon shot. A water pipe in the wall had frozen and burst, flooding their kitchen floor with water that turned to a sheet of rippled ice within minutes. They abandoned the room, sealing it off with blankets, and huddled in the parlor, feeding the stove with anything that would burn. Fence posts, broken chairs, their children's old cradle. The temperature in that room never got above 40 degrees. At Bill Putnam's cabin, the frost grew an inch thick on the heads of the nails holding the walls together. Perfect white circles, mapping the paths of escaping heat. They all slept in a single bed, buried under every blanket and coat they owned, their breath pluming in the air. The story was the same up and down the line. Wood piles vanished, coal bins emptied. It was a war of attrition against an enemy that never tired. Inside the silver Quonset, another reality existed. The furious wind howled over the curved steel shell, unable to find a corner or an edge to grip. The sound was a low, steady whoosh, like a distant waterfall, not the violent rattling and whistling that tormented the other houses. The little potbelly stove glowed with a dull red cheer, consuming a small fraction of the fuel their neighbors were burning. The temperature inside was a steady 75 degrees. The contrast was not just in numbers, it was in the small, mundane details of life. Olena baked bread. The dough rose perfectly in a bowl set on the small wooden table, feet away from the stove. In any other house, it would have been a frozen lump. Andrei and Lydia, ages 7 and 5, were in their shirt sleeves, drawing on slate boards on the floor. There were no coughs, no huddling, no fear. The air was warm, dry, and still. But the most potent symbol of their impossible comfort sat on a simple wooden shelf mounted to the interior wall. It was a large earthenware crock filled with borscht Olena had made a few days prior. It was their Malanka supper for the Ukrainian New Year. In any other house in Punxsutawney that week, a pot of soup left on a shelf, away from the fire, would have been a solid block of ice in hours. In the Wainwright's cabin, a pot of water left on the back of the stove itself, the warmest place in the house, had frozen solid before the coals from the last fire had even cooled. But in the Quonset, the borscht remained perfectly liquid. Its deep, warm red color was a vibrant, living defiance of the frozen gray world outside. It was not just soup, it was proof. On the 7th day of the polar surge, Herschel Lofton was making his rounds. His job in this weather was grim. He wasn't inspecting for code violations. He was performing welfare checks, driving the back roads of the county to make sure people hadn't frozen in their homes. His mood was as gray as the sky. The sheer scale of the cold's victory was oppressive. Every house he visited was a scene of misery, a testament to the futility of fighting a Pennsylvania winter with conventional means. He was cold, tired, and his sedan's heater was fighting a losing battle of its own. As he turned onto the unpaved track leading to the bituminous camp, he saw Kovalenko's small clearing. The silver arch was covered in a thick layer of wind-sculpted snow, making it look like a natural drift, an organic part of the landscape. He thought of the citation he'd issued. A grim, bitter satisfaction settled in him. He had warned the man. Now Kovalenko and his family were likely in mortal danger, trapped in that flimsy, undersized metal shed. It was his duty to check on them, to arrange for their evacuation to the emergency shelter at the town hall. He pressed the accelerator to drive the final 100 yards. The engine sputtered. It coughed once, twice, then fell silent. He tried the ignition again. Nothing. The fuel line had frozen solid. A string of curses fogged the inside of his windshield. Stranded. The nearest working phone was at the mine office, a 2-mile walk, in a wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Then he looked up and saw the thin plume of smoke rising from the Quonset's flue. It wasn't the thick, panicked smoke of a fire being desperately overfed. It was a thin, lazy, confident curl. They were in there, and they had a stove. He could get warm, maybe use their phone if they had one. He pulled on his hat and gloves, wrapped his scarf over his face, and stepped out into the brutal, biting cold. The walk was only 100 yards, but by the time he reached the oak door, his face was numb, and his lungs ached from inhaling the frigid air. He pounded on the door with a gloved fist. The door swung open. Taras Kovalenko stood there, wearing a simple flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled to the elbow. Lofton had prepared himself for what he would find inside. He expected a blast of frigid air, the smell of damp wool and misery, a family huddled around a sputtering fire under a mountain of blankets. He expected to be the rescuer. What he felt instead was a gentle, silent wave of dry, impossible warmth. It washed over his frozen face, into his lungs. The air didn't move. It was still. He blinked, his eyes adjusting from the gray gloom to the warm, soft light of a single lantern. He saw the two children playing on the floor, barefoot. He saw Olena stirring something on the potbelly stove, her face relaxed and serene. His gaze fell upon the shelf and the crock of deep red borscht, impossibly, defiantly liquid. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and unwrapped the scarf from his face. He was speechless. He ran a bare hand along the curved inner wall. He expected to feel the biting cold of the steel, the dampness of condensation. He felt nothing but a neutral, room-temperature surface. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even cool. It was just there. Taras gestured to the table. "Mr. Lofton, you look cold. Please, sit. Olena, a bowl for Mr. Lofton." The inspector sank onto a small wooden stool, his mind struggling to reconcile the howling wasteland outside with the peaceful sanctuary he had just entered. He looked from the children to the stove, to the borscht, to the curved ceiling. He looked at Taras, the mockery, the citations, the certainty of his own expertise. It all collapsed into dust. He had been so profoundly, so completely wrong. He finally found his voice, but it was quiet, full of a dawning awe. He looked at the smooth, continuous curve of the wall. "You didn't build a shelter, Kovalenko," Herschel Lofton said, his voice barely a whisper. "You built a harbor." The story of how the county inspector's car froze, and he was forced to take refuge in the very home he had condemned, became the stuff of local legend. Lofton, humbled and converted, tore up the citation. More than that, he became the Quonset's most vocal advocate. When the brutal winter finally broke, he brought the mine superintendent and 2 members of the county board to see the structure for themselves. Taras, a man of few words, explained not with rhetoric, but with arithmetic. He drew the shapes in the dirt with a stick, a box, and a hemisphere. He wrote out the numbers for surface area. He explained the principle of still air in the insulation. He never gloated. He never said, "I told you so." He simply shared the knowledge. The impact was immediate and profound. Word spread through the tight-knit Ukrainian-American communities of western Pennsylvania. A cousin of Olena's, who worked for the Svoboda Ukrainian-language newspaper in Jersey City, heard the story and wrote a feature article. In April of 1950, the paper published a full page with the headline, "The CB's Ark, a Zakarpattia Secret for a Pennsylvania Winter." It included Taras's simple plans, a list of materials, and the core calculations of surface area and heat loss. The response was electric. The story resonated deeply with other immigrant veterans who, like Taras, carried both Old World knowledge and New World technical skills. They understood the logic immediately. That summer, the familiar shape of the mini Quonset began to appear in other coal patches and farmsteads. By the autumn of 1950, 4 other Ukrainian vet families across Jefferson and Indiana counties had built their own versions. They were small, cheap, and by the standards of the day, strange. But they worked. Reports came back of families cutting their fuel consumption by 80%, of winters passed in unprecedented comfort and security. The idea, once mocked, was now being proven, house by house. Kovalenko's innovation was not just a clever trick. It was a fundamental paradigm shift that anticipated the core principles of modern building science by decades. Today we have names for what he did. We talk about the building envelope, the importance of a continuous insulation and air barrier. The most energy-efficient homes in the world, like those built to the German Passive House standard, are obsessed with the very things Taras focused on: minimizing surface area to volume ratio, super insulating, and achieving near-perfect air tightness. These modern homes, with their complex ventilation systems and high-tech materials, are direct descendants of the simple, powerful idea embodied in that little surplus Quonset hut. Taras Kovalenko, with his ancestral memories and his military training, had built a passive house before the term even existed. There is a lesson in the silvery curve of that small hut that transcends architecture and physics. The prevailing wisdom of the frontier, a mindset forged by hardship, was often one of brute force. If the winter is cold, build a bigger fire. If the walls are thin, use thicker logs. The solution was always more wood, more coal, more mass, more effort. It was a war of attrition against the natural world. Taras Kovalenko didn't declare war on winter. He refused to fight on its terms. He brought a different kind of wisdom, one not of force, but of elegance. He understood that the shape of a thing could be more important than its size. He understood that the enemy wasn't the cold, but the careless loss of the heat you already had. He didn't build a bigger cabin to stand against the winter. He built a small hemisphere and let the simple, beautiful laws of geometry hold every precious BTU inside. The solution wasn't to add more, it was to lose less. It was a quiet revolution of efficiency, born in the mountains of Ukraine, tested in the Pacific, and proven in the heart of a Pennsylvania winter. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you believe, as we do, that these histories of forgotten ingenuity deserve to be told, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other examples of old world knowledge solving new world problems can you think of? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictionalized. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.